Welcome to another Dragonlance Saga Hangout. It is Krynn or New Cult 28th. My name is Adam. Today I'm discussing this is a question, what makes an epic fantasy campaign setting? I would like to take a moment and thank the DL Saga YouTube members and Patreon patrons and invite you to consider becoming a member or patron. You can even pick up Dragonlance Media or get $10 by signing up to start playing .games using my affiliate links in the description below. All right, so the whole crux of this, what makes a fantasy campaign set, I feel like I have hair just dangling. The crux of what makes an epic fantasy campaign setting is that I'm making my own. And so what I'm going to do is present my 3 favorite fantasy campaign settings, and then I'm going to compare and contrast those to the one that I'm developing, and hopefully I can come to some sort of understanding about what makes an epic fantasy campaign setting. And what I would like, if I may be so bold, is for your input. So I'm going to be putting up some polls. I'll put up the first poll right now throughout this conversation. And you give me your feedback. You let me know what you think in this. So this first poll is, what makes a fantasy feel epic? So we've got 4 options. I know it's going to be a little this and a little that for most people, but let's just pretend you only have one answer. What is the most important part of what makes a fantasy campaign setting epic? Let me know in the comments. All right, there's the poll. Hey, Chris, how you doing? What's up, Corey? Appreciate you tuning in. Soulforge, how you doing? Great to see you. All right, so before we dive into that conversation, while you're looking at the poll, how about we talk a little Anthology? Because we only have a month. We've got like a month and 3 days. Well, no, because February doesn't have 28 days, does it? No, it doesn't. It has exactly 28 days. I knew that. I was testing you guys, is what I was doing. Yeah, so we've got basically, 4.5 weeks for you to finish your fantasy short story to be included in the DL Saga Anthology. And I actually have a number of different titles and subtitles for that anthology. One of them is not More Dragons of Krynn. Definitely not. Deep history adds tension to build on, for sure. Sigmar, thanks for tuning in. All right, so let's, the DL Saga Anthology short stories, it has to be under 8,000 words. A month is way more time than you need to actually write a short story. It has to be submitted to me by March 1st. And if you want me to save space for you, I would encourage you to visit dlsaga.com/contributors or email me at info@dlsaga.com and I'll do my best to carve out space for you. Basically what's going to happen is once March 1st hits and I have the total amount of short stories, I'm going to start going through them. And the ones that I want to include, I will send out contracts for first publishing rights, and then you can publish them again after this anthology is out. Once you've signed and returned that, then we'll go back and forth about the artwork for the beginning of your story, because I'm going to do my own little illustrations for the beginning of each one of these. And I'll do live streams for each of the illustrations, so you can see it from the full process to the end. On Patreon, I'm actually going to be releasing my short story to the developer patrons so that they get a first look at what that short story is. And let me tell you something. It's good. I'm not just saying that because I wrote it. All right, I'm saying it because I wrote it, but it is really good. It is. Anyway, anyone that wants to contribute, I welcome. It doesn't have to be explicitly about this campaign setting. It can be generic to any fantasy world that would reasonably be something similar to. But we're calling it DL Saga because of copyrights. So it's a DL Saga anthology, not anything else. All right. So let's get into the topic today. This is a hangout. We're just chilling. 28 days. You thought we were using the Krynn calendar. Oh, you better have yours, or I'm going to phone call you. That's how you say it. I'm going to phone call you. No telling how many civs have existed on Earth. There's so many different offshoots of mankind. Oh, for sure. If human existence has existed for 200,000 years, but we only have evidence of human life existing 28,000 years, what happened to all the other years? I understand evolution is a part of this, but still. All right. I've been a Dragonlance. Oh man, should we measure our Dragonlance fandom? How far back does yours go? You wonder what alien dragon world Kelendros was from? Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's never explicitly stated, and originally it wasn't even from another planet. It wasn't until War of Souls that idea even came out. Originally, they were just from across the sea, as if there was some other continent that those dragons came from, which I found really, really interesting. Maybe you play dragons. I mean, if you want to write a short story about that, that'd be really interesting too. You can name the planet, you love the lore and the deep history for the campaign setting, for sure. All right, so what makes an epic fantasy campaign setting? Epic fantasy isn't just about maps or gods or ancient wars. It's about a world that remembers itself. A setting becomes epic when history leaves scars, belief shapes reality, and culture exists beyond stat blocks. So tonight isn't about which setting is best. It's about why some worlds feel inevitable and others feel disposable, and what DMs can learn from the masters and from darker, more modern designs like my own Direlands. All right. So shoot in the comment here. When you think of epic fantasy, what is the first thing that comes to mind? It doesn't have to be from the poll. I mean, if you think of, I don't know, Teletubbies for some reason, put it out there. Or maybe not, because there's judgments attached with that. That we will 100% be judging you if you throw out Teletubbies. All right, so some of the touchstones that I wanted to talk about were Tolkien's Middle-earth, which is the first epic fantasy world. And even today, after so many years, it feels epic in scope. I'm actually just now getting to the end of The Two Towers, which I started on Monday. I've never read it before. Of course, I've seen the extended versions of the films and the original theatrical cut of the films, but they're different. They're different. And I'm loving this trilogy that I really should have read when I was a kid, but I never got around to. Thanks, Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman. Then, of course, I wanted to talk about my adult favorite fantasy campaign setting, which is Westeros. George R.R. Martin's Westeros. His whole Game of Thrones, or actually as the novels refer to it, A Song of Ice and Fire. I think it is incredibly epic. It's got massive history, a huge globe with tons of different cultures and excitement happening all around it. I mean, it's very adult, but I absolutely adore it. So that's another fantasy campaign I want to be talking about today. And of course, it's a Dragonlance channel. I love Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman's Dragonlance. And I say that rather than just Dragonlance because we've had so many different authors sort of put their fingers in the Dragonlance pond, and not all of them are great. Not all of them are epic. So when I think of Dragonlance, it's really the first 6 books that I'm thinking of. Everything else, of course, is Dragonlance, but it's not that epic scope, where it's about this global catastrophe with, ages of history that's being loosely referenced, and this incredible adventure that these uncommon heroes are going on, which then leads to a prequel and a sequel series about time travel and incredibly powerful mages and, standing up to gods and stuff. I mean, it's just epic in scope. So you kind of have to include it. So a comparison afterward, I'm going to do a comparison to my own Direlands dark fantasy campaign setting that I'm still I'm almost ready to do a book about it, but I'm not quite there yet. So it's a dark fantasy campaign setting built with many of the same tools, but different intentions. And intentions are really, really important when it comes to developing your own campaign setting or your own epic fantasy setting. And so this whole conversation is going to be framed for dungeon masters, for world builders, and really anyone who wants their setting to feel lived in and not just described. Oh, yeah, Carlium. Star Wars novels are the EU novels. To you, they feel like fan fiction? I feel like well, I don't know. You didn't mention EU. I don't want to project. I think what's now called the Legends and the original EU, I think those were really epic. Once they got past the Thrawn trilogy and they went way into crazy deep lore, it got really interesting, in my opinion. Some wacky, crazy stuff too, but still, it was dope as hell. David, how you doing? Thanks for tuning in. Chronicles and Legends are good tier. Most everything else is not as good. Let's see. Star Wars EU are actual sequels. Yeah, that's how I see it too, David. 100%. All right, so let's while we're going to be diving into part 1, which is your core elements of epic fantasy, and this is how I see epic fantasy. You let me know if you see it differently than I do. Let's do another poll. So right now, our first poll, deep history, followed closely by culture and lore, which is what you all are saying makes fantasy feel epic. Very interesting. All right, let's do another one. With a fantasy campaign setting, what hooks you first? Is it the history? Is it the politics? Is it the gods and myth? Or is it tone and mood? Let me know in this poll coming at you. And then I'll just dive in here. So, the first part that I think are core elements of epic fantasy are the deep recorded history. Epic fantasy has epics of history, like massive time that's sort of cordoned off because of huge global events. And it's not just a backstory to what's actively happening. It's something that you can travel to and actually play in or explore through fiction, right? History isn't just flavor text, it's pressure. Wars rise and civilizations collapse, and there are consequences to choices made by rulers. So if nothing important happens before the characters were born, the world isn't really epic. It's empty so far. And let's be fair, this is actually, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, for example, this is how Dungeons and Dragons was meant to be started. You start tabula rasa with that blank slate, and you and your players build out the campaign milieu from that point. That's not what epic fantasy does. Epic fantasy already has a huge scope, and you're just placed down at one given point in that scope to then explore or read about heroes exploring. The second part that I think is very important is cosmology that touches the world. Whether there's active gods or not, there is a belief in them. So gods aren't distant abstractions. They're actually a part of it. And one thing that I love about our own real world, I'm going on a limb here and saying I love our world, is that we have such a vast cultural history, no matter where you are regionally on this planet. The history of humankind and the cultures of those regions go back so far. I mean, just so far as we know culture goes back to the last ice age, circa 12,500 years ago. And then we're discovering that there's buried cultural history that goes back way beyond that we don't know anything about, which is really exciting. It means that our world is just like every other fantasy world. It's infinitely deeper and richer than we are aware of right now. It's filled with gods and heroes and myths and war and excitement and tragedy and pain. I mean, just look at any point of our own human history and you can get great ideas for fantasy, for epic fantasy. But yeah, I think the cosmology that touches the world is an incredibly important part of epic fantasy. And the cosmology should create conflicts in the world. It should create factions within the world. And it creates cultural divides in the world, which I think is really interesting. You said stars, you're referring to certain books. Lords of the Sith feels like fan fiction. Oh, I see what you're saying. That's cool. And it doesn't, we're all just sharing our opinions. So there's no right or wrong. It's just our personal opinion. Mood is key, as your wife tells you every night. It doesn't seem to be the right mood. Huh. All right, so the next element that I think makes really great epic fantasy is a world scarred by war. This is the most human expression. We formulate into tribes, a bunch of different tribes everywhere. We decide we want to either take over different areas, spreading our tribe out, or we just, for one reason or another, don't like the other tribes and we want to go to war with them. It could be resources, it could be women, it could be men, it could literally be any reason that the tribe believes, but war is as inevitable as creation when it comes to the human expression. And so epic fantasy to me always has some sort of post-traumatic event. They're living in a time that is the reaction, the fallout of some other great time. Our human history is ripe with this. Doesn't even matter where you live on this planet. Peace itself, it's always something you aspire to as a culture, but it's always through the lens of, well, we have to eliminate this threat in order to have peace. So it's like these cycles of war that lead to times of peace. And there's always some other war on the horizon, different factions warring for some reason or vying for power or control or anything. And victory always costs something. So the survivors of that traumatic experience in history have trauma associated with it, with the dwarves in Dragonlance, for example. Nidar dwarves, the hill dwarves outside of Thorbarden, hate the Hylar dwarves and the mountain dwarves because they shut them out after the cataclysm. The mountain dwarves had a reason, whether you think that was a good reason or not, is less than relevant because they still shut them out for it. And so the cultures warred with each other. The elves split apart from one nation into two through the Kinslayer Wars, in an epic way before the world is ever written on the page. And so we have this history of traumatic experiences. Middle Earth had an entire age that existed with this huge war of this Sauron creature that commanded armies and fought against the free peoples, corrupting them and destroying them slowly through these rings. And then he was narrowly defeated. And then we have the traumatic fallout of that. And that's where the Lord of the Rings trilogy comes into play. In Westeros, we have entire seasons, as they're referenced, which are just epics of time, where the White Walkers and the Whites from the north come swarming south and fighting people and destroying all humanity. And humanity that exists has to fight them off. And this is a cyclical event that they have to face. So there's always this sort of experience of massive wars and then the recovery and then the threat of massive wars and having to stand against it. War of the Lance, yet the latest. That's the fourth Dragon War after the third Dragon War that preceded it 1,000 years before. So if the last Great War solved everything cleanly, you've written a fairy tale, not epic fantasy. There has to be continued threats and continued designs by someone or something in order for the world to feel really, truly epic. The next element that I think is a really great one to include would be mythic creatures with narrative weight. So dragons, elves, fays, giants, these aren't just monsters, they're symbols in the world. Each race carries its own history, its own loss, and its own perspective, informed by those traumas we mentioned just a moment ago. So if elves are just humans with pointy ears, then you're wasting epic tools. If dragons are just creatures that are believed to exist at one point, but they never rear their ugly heads again, well, then there's no reason to even include them, except for his fairy tales. So, with Sauron, for example, before he was ever named in the latest age in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it was always the Dark One. They didn't even want to say his name because they feared that even by mentioning his name, it would draw his attention or he would actually rise anew. And the reality is he did rise anew. So it doesn't matter what, and again, the White Walkers or the newest, latest king in Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire is in for Westeros's world that sort of mythic creature that modern generations don't even believe exists. They're fairy tales that they tell about winter is coming. And then when it does come, people are like, oh shit, that wasn't a fairy tale. That's real. It's coming. So always remember to include some form of mythic creatures that have a narrative weight. It doesn't have to be traditional fantasy tropes, but there has to be something to it in order to create, in my opinion, epic fantasy. And the last one I wanted to cover about what makes epic fantasy are cultures beyond combat. The music of the individual cultures, the poetry, the recipes, stories told by the people of the world about their own heroes in their myths and in their histories. That's what really adds that depth, that richness to an epic fantasy, because then each culture may be talking about the same events or the same gods or the same heroes, but they filter it through their own cultural lens, which is wildly different. So you can just look at the flood myth, right? We know there was global floods at some points in our histories because there's evidence of it. But each culture talks about those floods in different ways with very similar little pieces of tropes. It all sort of stems from the Epic of Gilgamesh as far as our recorded history goes. But whether it's Noah's Ark or whether it's the Chinese had a reference to fire and then floods, which can be interpreted in modern lenses as like a meteor came down, melted, like flash melted a bunch of glaciers and caused floods around the world because of that. We have the Younger Dryas period up in North America on the sort of Canadian and Washington border, where we see huge washes, evidence of massive washes of the glaciers melting incredibly fast and the water rushing out from it in those areas. So we know globally there was a catastrophe, but every single culture has its own version of that flood myth. And your fantasy world should share that same cultural connection, but filtered through their own existence, you know? That's what makes it really feel deep and powerful. So culture is how players emotionally anchor themselves to a setting. Characters being your written characters, your heroes in your story, or the players if you're actually doing like a TTRPG, for example. So let me know what piece of world building made a setting feel real to you. I would love to hear that while we look at the tone and mood here. So what hooks you first? It looks like the tone and mood hooks people first, followed by gods and myth. Really interesting. All right. So while you guys are answering that, I'm going to do another poll because I got a bunch of these. I love this topic, by the way. What is your favorite epic style? I'm only going to include the main three that I'm talking about. If you have a different one, just put it in the comments. So is it Tolkien as a mythic epic style? Is it Game of Thrones, a political epic style? Or is it Dragonlance, a heroic epic style? What is your favorite epic style? All right, so let's see. I want to see what you guys are saying here in the comments real quick. Legendary, don't forget to pass this on to your children, grandchild. Yeah, for sure. Mood is key. Oh, we already talked about that. When playing and learning about regions of the campaign setting, you always enjoy it. Oh, you should definitely read Lord of the Rings again. No matter how good the lore and myth is, it needs to have characters that you care about somehow. Absolutely. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to epic fantasy is how the classics do it, right? How does Middle-earth create its epic fantasy? So what works in Middle-earth? It has unparalleled depth of history. It has songs and poems and language baked into the world. And after it was written, we now have people writing about recipes and creating music and extrapolating on the world, creating films about it. I mean, it's really, it just lives on in the human expression globally because it worked so well. Not initially. It was actually not, it didn't go off very well when it first came out. It took time. Of course, there was also limitations. The mythic distance can reduce player agency if you're going to run through it. Or it feels like how can the heroes in the story really affect anything if there's so much pre-established history, right? They feel tiny and small compared to the world itself. So finding that really healthy balance is really important, especially if you're bringing it to a TTRPG setting. The world feels preordained. A lot of people complain about playing in Dragonlance. I don't want to try Dragonlance yet. We're going to get to there. But it's because the world feels preordained, right? So Middle Earth, like huge events have already happened. So if you're going to be playing a game or writing a story in Middle Earth, what are you going to be writing about or playing? Or, setting up as a DM, what kind of adventure are they going to have? Are they just going to be following other people in the pre-established events? Or are you going to craft brand new experiences that may not be touched on, that's just sort of hinted at globally? Like by the time Frodo and Samwise get to the gates of Mordor with Gollum is talking about how Mordor has already seized and controlled all of the lands. I'm trying to remember. I just read this today, but it's like loose in my head. Like to the south or something, south and the east. So he's already conquered tons of space, and now he's just focusing on the west. So if that's already happened, but it's never really explored, maybe you could do something there. Like have stories about how that conquest ended, what the heroes did. Is it a tragedy where the heroes died, or did the heroes move west and warn the western folks in kingdoms? So there's a lot of like ways that you could sort of play in it, even though it is still an established global event type world. So it can be hard to run long sandbox campaigns without fighting with the canon, but that's why I think at everyone's individual table, anecdotally, we have our own version of the canon, inspired by the players. And of course, Dragonlance did a really wonderful way of this by just having the modules and then the actual novels. And the novels do not follow the modules to a T. There are variations and changes that the players can have in their own run through and still sort of feel like they're influencing the greater world at large, even if it doesn't mimic the novels themselves. So lessons for a dungeon master is myth gives weight, right, to the world, but too much destiny can then suffocate choice when you're crafting your own epic fantasy campaign settings. So always be conscious of that. Your DL game is set in 434. Oh, wow. Using the Savage Worlds Pathfinder setting. Oh, interesting. Okay. I've never run Savage Worlds in my life, or Pathfinder, like in any way. So I don't know anything about it. New heroes exploring the captured lands. Yeah, that would be a good way of doing it. So the next one I wanted to talk about is Westeros. And this is the historical epic. So what works with George R.R. Martin's writings? Well, history as cycles of violence. Power structures feel real. Culture varies sharply by region. And consequences are relentless. Like when stuff hits, it hits hard and people suffer for it. And it happens so quick that you sort of don't really realize it. I mean, if anyone hasn't seen the first few episodes of Game of Thrones, I'm about to spoil it for you, but you should know by now. Stark gets decapitated in the first season, like really early on. And it's a huge shock. Like, oh my gosh. And it just sort of lets you know this is the world you're playing in. Or the new season, it's again, well, I'm not going to spoil it. There are two events in the first two episodes, one event in each of the first two episodes that are shocking. And it just lets you know immediately, this is the world we're playing in right now. And you're just taken aback by those actions, by those events. So there's limitations, of course, to this version of epic fantasy as well. Minimal cosmology engagement. So there's not a whole lot of dealing with gods. They're referenced, but they're referenced as almost like we see it in most of our real world religions, where they're not necessarily anthropomorphic deities, but we sort of have religions and organizations established around them and behaviors associated with those religious movements. That's kind of how Game of Thrones and Westeros deals with it. Though there are gods, it's set up to be like 7 gods took over the one god in Westeros's history. So it really depends on the age that you're dealing with. And then, of course, myths exist, but it's so distant to be kind of unclear. Bran the Builder, did he really build the wall that held back these White Walkers, or is it literally just a myth that this guy did it? And it's just, a wall that sprung up over ages and ages of people slowly building it up, because of this fantasy of a threat of winter coming again with the White Walkers. So, understanding that hope is often absent. You don't have to have a hopeful outcome to your epic fantasy campaign settings. Some people really like the idea that there isn't default hope, and that's something that you have to find. It's something you have to carve out. It's something you have to bring with you in order to really understand this epic scale of fantasy. And I kind of like that idea too, because the idea of aspirations and emotions like love and hope are dangerous in some governments, governmental structures, in some cultures. They're just dangerous ideas that are snuffed out as soon as they are discovered, because they can lead to the toppling of those governments or institutions. And so the idea of coming into a campaign and trying to find love and hope and trying to then use that to turn the tide of characters' behaviors or perceptions and then ultimately rise up against whatever regime is in place that's squashing it is a great way of dealing with epic fantasy. So some lessons for dungeon masters out there with this type of a fantasy campaign setting would be political realism creating tension. But without mythic meaning, darkness can feel nihilistic. It can feel inevitable, and it can feel pointless to try to stand against it. So you always want to make sure that there's a little room for reactions of players' choices. Without that, then it can just be depressing. All right, what do you guys have to say here? Pathfinder gamer, friendly on starting out. Pathfinder, you don't know anything about the world, you just stole the classes. Nice. There certainly was one event that was very shocking in episode 2. You personally like dystopian settings, more the heroes have to overcome, more epic the tale. Yeah, I'm kind of with you there as well. Let's look at favorite settings. Hey, it is a Dragonlance channel. Shocking that most people liked Dragonlance of the 3. Tolkien was next. Wow, no one loves Game of Thrones. All right. I dig it. I'm going to throw up another poll, though. That's right. There's more. Let's see. Let's do a cosmology check. Gods should be ... distant, active, felt via faith, or barely present. All of those, depending on the age, can relate to Dragonlance, but also to our own world, which is very interesting to me. So let me know what you think. Should the gods be what? All right, let's get back into this because we're going to talk about Dragonlance now and how it deals with epic fantasy. We all know these ones because, again, this is why we're on this channel. But still, let's talk about it. So what works with Dragonlance? Well, it has clear epics and ages. We know what happens when. So if we ever want to drop characters into those ages, or we ever want to write stories in those ages, we know exactly what's going on. The gods directly shape events in the world. So if there's an absence of the gods, it's sort of open for interpretation on the human level. War will define generations. People will live and die in times of conflict and the resolution of that conflict and the outcome of that conflict. And it's built for play, not just reading. There's whole modules that were built simultaneously with the novels that were written so that you can either read or game or do both and experience different outcomes, but it still feels epic in scope. There are some limitations that we have to acknowledge here. Archetypical characters can feel restrictive. Um, when you don't have room to stretch legs because it's narrowly defined by Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, well then you are pretty limited with the types of characters that you can build. They do have a lot of cultures within each of those races and classes, so that can add some color to your experience. There's moral clarity that can limit ambiguity. So Dragonlance operates on a good evil spectrum and this idea of balance. So neutrality is going to side with either good or evil depending on which one is more in power. And that balance can limit your storytelling if you don't want to just have ambiguous sort of campaigns. And then, of course, some depth is sacrificed for accessibility. So it can't be too detailed out. We just know that there was a hero named Huma at the time that the modules and the books were written originally, the first 6. And we know that there was a a war that the Queen of Darkness was defeated in, which is the catalyst for the modern era when all this stuff was being written initially. And so we already have the story beats. And so stretching your legs narratively can feel restrictive in that time. But again, that's where creativity comes to play. So a lesson for DMs in this type of world is epic fantasy at the table thrives on clarity, but nuance keeps it alive long term. So you're going to want to really develop out each individual culture so that you can find differentiation for characters to explore and have different feeling experiences. And I think Dragonlance has done a wonderful job with that. I would argue that Dragonlance has done a better job of variety than Tolkien ever even tried to do in its one continent of Ansalon versus Middle Earth. And then, of course, Westeros, it has a bunch of different continents, and each of those continents have their own variety of culture and stuff rather than specific areas. I mean, you have Dorne and you have the North, and those are two very different, but everything in the middle of Westeros is pretty much the same. You know, it's all like middle. Oh my gosh, I can't, I can't think and talk. It's all Middle Ages type life, and that's kind of it, you know. But when you go north, you start dealing with more fantasy, and you then deal with the Wall, and then beyond that, beyond the Wall, you have the White Walkers, and you go down to Dorne, it's a completely different culture, and you go to different continents, and it's completely different cultures everywhere. So it really just depends on where you want to go. But Dragonlance, just on the one continent, has an incredible array. Just like if you went to Europe, for example, you know, all the way from Russia down to South Africa, tons of different cultures. And then if you just want to go to North America down to South America, you have a huge array of different historical cultures. So always try to think in those terms where you may have a dominant sort of controlling government or force, a nation, but you want differentiation in that nation so that you do have the opportunity of customizing experiences. Hey, Justin, how you doing? So you like the gods to not have an active role in fantasy. I know that it's the opposite of your favorite setting, Dragonlance, but when the gods interfere too much, it takes away agency from the player characters. I could see that. The gods active to an extent, not smothering the adventure. Yeah, I totally agree with that. All right, so we're almost done here. Before I dive into my own Direlands setting and the approach I took, I want to sort of look at this poll and put up another one. So the gods should be, the overwhelming response is felt via faith. And then we have a tied secondary of distant and active. So I like how everyone has their own interpretations of what works with divinity in an epic fantasy campaign setting. So let's do one more poll before we're done. What's a more compelling world to you? Here are the options. Is it a world that's waiting to be saved? Or is it a world that's just damaged by victory? What's more compelling to you? And this feeds directly into my own fantasy campaign setting. So after after I think it was 2 years of creating just tons of Dragonlance content, I started thinking, why the hell am I putting so much time and effort into someone else's creation when I could just put some time and effort into my own? And so I started creating Direlands. I've got a huge amount of information on it already. And so as I'm continuously putting out new information, I thought, well, how about I compare and contrast this to my favorite campaign settings and see how it stands up? Is it epic fantasy in contrast? And that's only going to help me then do it going forward. And then for all of you watching, what about your own campaign settings? Have you created one before? And if you have, is it epic or is it sort of mundane in its approach? And do you want to develop it out to be epic? Here's some, ideas just on this entire conversation in order to do that. So where Direlands aligns with epic fantasy for me is it's recorded history, but with bias. So epics are defined by conquest, by ice. There's a huge frozen age that is existing in right now, and then the liberation of oppression. And history is acknowledged and written by the victors and by the conquestors, not an objective history outlining events. So it is very much through a lens of a specific type of culture that history in my campaign setting is outlined. And every culture has its own interpretation of history, its own interpretation of gods, its own interpretation of each other. The cosmology warps reality itself. There are cosmic entities that are beyond gods. Maybe they are creations of the gods, but they are certainly acting independently from them and actually standing up to them in some cases, vying for dominance of the world and living beyond the world, waiting to come in and take over. There's 2 moons with mechanical and narrative impact. There's one moon that is persistent, that is believed to have cultures living on it, but there's another moon that is on a 25-year-old cycle. And when it comes near in that 25-year cycle, it opens this magical land bridge where monstrosities and aberrations descend onto the planet. And so there's this continuous cycle that is repeated that the people of Direlands, the planet is called Kirdvanig, they have to deal with. And some more than others, because if you live in that region, of course, you're going to be terrorized by that. If you don't live in the region, you may not even be aware of it at all. There's gods that are tied to culture and language and region. And again, very mythic and very abstract, hands-off, until you get into certain areas or you go back in time, and then you realize that, no, they are actually there. They just... there's an actual reason why they're not active. And so it's this rich lore that you can sort of uncover in layers, And of course, the world is set after this huge victory. There was this witch queen that was defeated, that was subjugating the whole world. But nothing is healed from that victory. And in fact, the people that overthrew her, that all united to overthrow her, have then become corrupted themselves in their own sense of power and authority and victory. So there is no version of, we're the good guys, we overthrow the bad guys, and we stay the good guys. No, there's, just like human culture in our own world, everyone turns evil when power is in their hands. It is inevitable. Power corrupts absolutely. And so I'm just playing with that trope. And then, of course, there's mythic races with consequences. When the Witch Queen was in control, she subjugated the demi-races. Elves were exiled or assassinated on sight. Dwarves fled underground to avoid subjugation. Halflings ended up being isolated and retreating to their home continent. There are tons of cultural texture, with each culture having its own version of language, its own version of music. I actually paid a really talented Wow. I want to say musician, but it's actually bigger than that. He created these entire mythic themes for me based on a primitive culture, a monstrous culture, and an advanced civilized culture, and wove them all together in this beautiful classical piece as the theme song. it's not choreography. It's so, it's escaping me is what it is. And so it's huge in scope, right? And then of course so I'm going to be adding poetry, and I've got sheet music for the incredible composer. Thank you. Jeez, Chris, that was killing me. Appreciate it. And then of course there's religious schisms. There's tons of groups, and because the Witch Queen was a woman who subjugated men and refused to allow them to use magic, once she was overthrown, now women are not trusted with magic either. So any magic using culture had to go underground and be a secret organization, and they have their own political and faction alliances and plans that affect nations and different cultures all around them. So it's this huge political, socio-political maneuvering global world cultures that is very reminiscent in that frame to the Game of Thrones, where there's a bunch of different cultures vying for power, but it's on a global scale rather than a regional scale. So it's very epic just in scope itself. So where Direlands intentionally diverges from other epic fantasy campaign settings is that most epic fantasy campaigns ask, how do we save the world? And Direlands asks, what if the saving the world wasn't enough? What if it's just not enough to defeat the threat? What if there's some systemic problems that cannot just be solved through a war? Is war the systemic problem in itself? Is humanity, or whatever race, the elven or half-elf or dwarven or orcish races, are they themselves part of the problem because they want to have totality of expression rather than sharing the world with each other in respect or something? So it's not idealistic at all. It's really up to interpretation by the people at the table. But these are all questions that have to be addressed in the adventures, because there is no good guy, bad guy in this world that I've created. It's all perspective, very much like our own. So some practical insight that I put into this is Direlands is epic fantasy through erosion of cultural experience, of history, of the geography itself, not ascension. They're not rising to a higher state of being or anything. They're not elves going to their far off heaven realm after the Middle Earth age is over. They're not all celebrating as the Whitestone Council and unifying afterward. There's continued problems that just were never addressed. It was the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation when they came together in the first place. So the epic scale that I've created comes from systems of belief collapsing, not heroes rising, which makes it really texturally deep to experience. But again, it's my setting, so I'm going to have a specific point of view. Everyone else can just say, no, it sucks. And that's fair too. So let's see. We're at a 50-50 split. What makes a compelling world? Waiting to be saved, or a world that's damaged by victory? Both of them. Both make a very, very compelling world. All right. So if you're creating your own campaign setting, what can you steal from all of this in order to make it more rich, more compelling, more deep? And again, if you're just writing your own fantasy books, these are things that you need to consider. You know, do you want epic fantasy or not? And if you do, here's some ideas. Build history that players inherit, not just learn about. They're part of the history by being descendants of it. So their views of the history is colored. It has perspective that differs from someone else's cultural memory. And that's really important. Let the cosmology influence laws and fear and traditions. The gods, or the idea of the gods, are going to have effect on people. We see it in our own real world, and it certainly is reminiscent in many, if not every, epic fantasy campaign setting. Make war change culture permanently. Culture is created and defined by what came before it. And if those are global catastrophes or wars, that culture is going to be defined by that experience. So make sure that whatever the events happened in the past, they leave an effect on the cultures that experience them. Give races reason to mistrust each other. Unless you want everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya, there has to be reasons why races do not see eye to eye. It could just be lifestyle, if you want to go very, very simply, but it could be something more. Were they on different sides of the outcome of great wars or events? Did they help each other, but someone else took a more predominant role and sort of tamped down the role of some other races? I mean, just think of different ways that these different peoples could see things and then how they could be biased toward them. I think Dragonlance has a perfect example of this, of course, with the Cataclysm. Elves, dwarves blame humans because it was the king priest and he was a human. And then, of course, they hate each other. The dwarves hate other dwarves, and elves hate other elves, and humans hate other humans because we have national identities. Embed art and ritual into everyday life. Look, art is a huge, and ritual is a huge part of our own human identity. Arguably, again, when I said humans create and destroy, the create part is the art and the ritualistic behaviors. Whether it's religious or not, there are certain things that we just continually do, and that is create art expressions in literal physical, like paintings or music or literature, song. I mean, we go out of our way to express the human condition simultaneously while we destroy it, which is just the total hypocrisy of mortality. And yet, why not throw that into your fantasy campaign setting? And then decide what your world believes about hope. Is hope, and I always like to throw in love with that because they're both ideas that are revolutionary in a vacuum, right? They're ideas that will make you do something that you would never otherwise do. You would never even consider doing in the absence of them. So in the absence of hope and love, how does your world engage with itself? Does it fall down political or religious lines that stifle expression? Are those sparks that are snuffed out, or are they fueled by different cultures or races? Always ask those questions, and then always ask yourself, do you prefer heroic epic or dark epic at your table? And that's going to then influence the outcome of your own campaign settings. All right, so let's see what you guys have to say. Let's end this poll. Mark, thanks for tuning in. All right, let's see. Damaged by victory. You think a world waiting to be saved is white noise at this point. A world damaged by victory is more unique and interesting. You could see that. It's like Eberron, for example, being a damaged realm for victory. Good and evil are in the eye of the beholder, 100%. Just think of Raceling, for sure. For sure. Let's see. Good and evil are subjective, absolutely. You're looking at the Gothic Earth supplement for Ravenloft and the 2E Buck Rogers only because it adds the mechanics for using guns. I mean, you can see it set in another time. Yeah, in my own Direlands setting, there is technology that's created, but it's incredibly expensive because it hasn't been industrialized yet, and it's very, very rare, and it's large. Everything is big until you industrialize it, and then it shrinks down to usable sizes and becomes affordable to everyone. So there are things like cannons and flintlock weapons. It's just they're so rare because they're so expensive and they're so bulky that they're just not very practical for individuals to be carrying around and stuff. So I like the idea that technology exists. And I also really love the idea, and I've framed my entire campaign setting around this, and we see this in Dragonlance too, where we have different technological levels of people. We have what is referenced early on in Dragonlance as barbaric and civilized peoples of every race in different regions of nations and separate from nations. And I like the idea, because we see it in our real world as well, that you have different cultures at different technological levels operating right next to each other. It adds this textural depth to culture that it feels very real, even if it feels like it shouldn't be real, because most fantasy doesn't do that. But it is real. We have different cultures rising in different ways technologically at different paces, you know? And so why not include that in our own fantasy campaign settings? So I love that stuff too. Bows, swords, and tactical prowess with terrain play a part, subterfuge as a place, but shouldn't be overwhelming. And of course, love always should play a part. Totally agree with you, man. You're just trying to stay warm. Yeah, it's brutal. It's brutal in the States right now. I'm sure everywhere else too, but all right, and that's really all I had that I wanted to talk about. I thought it would be a nice little hangout to talk about epic fantasy and how we approach it, and then just how I've been approaching my own fantasy setting based on my favorite fantasy settings. So, you know, an idea here is epic fantasy isn't a checklist, it's an agreement between the world and the players. Tolkien gave us myth. Martin gave us consequences. Dragonlance gave us playability. And I'm trying to realize what happens after the epic victory. So as DMs, the real question isn't, is my world epic? It's, does my world remember what it's been through? And that's going to do it for this Dragonlance Hangout episode. Thank you guys so much for being a part of it and for contributing to the conversation. I really do appreciate that. Let me know what you think makes an epic campaign setting and what epic campaign setting is your favorite. Have you ever created your own campaign settings? Feel free to email me at info@dlsaga.com or leave a comment below. I would like to take a moment and remind you to subscribe to the YouTube channel, ring the bell to get notified of upcoming videos, and click the like button. It all goes to help other Dragonlance fans learn about this channel and its content. And this channel is all about celebrating the wonderful world of the Dragonlance Saga. I hope you'll join in that celebration. So, thanks for watching. This has been Adam with Dragonlance Saga, and until next time, Slanjavar.